Good afternoon, everyone. I am very, very pleased and proud to welcome all of you today as we celebrate, or at least initiate, the process of celebrating the 25th anniversary of the founding of the Dickey Center for International Understanding. My name is Ken Yalowitz, and I have the honor to be the current director of the Dickey Center. I personally did not have the privilege of knowing or meeting President Dickey, but I feel a strong sense of affinity and identification with him. We both spent a good deal of our careers in the United States State Department and then came to Dartmouth with the aim of preparing and educating students to become knowledgeable and active citizens in world affairs. Among his many accomplishments, John Sloan Dickey imparted to Dartmouth two significant legacies. First is an internationalism imbued with a sense of social responsibility, articulated most compellingly in his oft-quoted phrase, "The world's troubles are your troubles." The second is his strong commitment to the liberal arts, the liberating arts, as he referred to them. It is through liberal learning, according to Dickey, that we can become the better human beings needed to fix the world's troubles. This was embodied in the Great Issues course, which he initiated. It is indeed fitting, then, that those who sought to honor President Dickey's 25 years as president of Dartmouth chose to do so by creating a living entity that would perpetuate those legacies indefinitely. In 1982, alumni of the classes of John Dickey's presidency, foremost amongst whom we count Sandy McCulloch of the class of 1950, worked to create the Dickey Endowment, which in February 1982 was approved by the Board of Trustees. The aim of this endowment was, in the words of the trustees, and I quote, "to coordinate, sustain, and enrich the international dimension of liberal arts education at Dartmouth." Under the successive leadership of Leonard Reeser, class of 1944, Martin Sherwin, class of 1959, Gene Lyons, and Michael Mastinduno, the endowment has grown into a full-fledged center, each successive director expanding the reach of the center's programming and enhancing the qualities of its programs. 25 years later, we honor Dickey's legacy and celebrate the sense of responsibility he inspired in a quarter century of Dartmouth graduates through programming that touches students, faculty, and the greater Dartmouth community. We seek to bring the world to Dartmouth and Dartmouth to the world through ongoing programs such as Dickey Overseas Leave Term Student Internships, the 5 Dickey-sponsored student groups, support for faculty research overseas, and interdisciplinary faculty research groups on key issues of the day, and through new initiatives of the Dickey Center in global health in Tanzania, led by the Dickey Center in close partnership with Dean Steven Spielberg and the Dartmouth Medical School, on climate change in the North, led by Professor Ross Virginia, the director of the Dickey Institute of Arctic Studies, the Dickey Visiting Fellow Program, and finally, the introduction into the college of an international studies certificate program featuring a new course on global health. The center today is a tribute to President Dickey's determination that no Dartmouth student should leave Hanover without a strong understanding of the major problems of the day and a commitment to do something about them. All of this programming has been facilitated by the generosity and support of donors, including the classes of John Sloan Dickey, to whom we are sincerely grateful, and by Dartmouth for its institutional support and for the construction of our beautiful new premises in the Haldeman Center building. As the Dickey Center begins its second quarter century, the issues facing our country, while different than those of the post-World War II era in 1945, are every bit as dangerous, complex, and also promising. We are being brought together by communications, the internet, international trade, and globalization. Yet at the same time, there are very threatening cross-currents, such as the loss of cultural identity through globalization, climate change, terrorism, ethnic and religious conflict, and the continuing scourge of poverty and disease that know no boundaries. Indeed, as in President Dickey's day, there is a strong need for understanding these problems and an equally strong need to commit to do something about them. We are proud to continue President Dickey's strategy of liberal learning to help Dartmouth students and faculty become the better people that will respond to those challenges. I would now like to begin today's program by calling on the president of Dartmouth, Jim Wright. Jim has been a very strong supporter of the Dickey Center programs, and we are very grateful to him for the realization of the dream of the new Haldeman Center building. President Wright.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you all. It's a pleasure, certainly for me, to be with you this afternoon as we celebrate so quickly, it would seem, the 25th anniversary of the John Sloan Dickey Center. I'm honored, really, by the presence of our speaker and our guest this afternoon, Dr. Harlem Brundtland, to Dartmouth. She has served her nation, and she has served her world. And it's hard to ask any more of that of any person than what she has done and continues to do. She's done so much to further our ability to fight disease and promote health globally and proactively. We've all benefited in no small way from her pursuit of an integrated and a responsive process for sustainable international development. We are impressed by her pursuit of knowledge and understanding, and by her conviction that given the choice, people will make the right decisions. I certainly want to acknowledge and to thank my colleague Ken Yalowitz and all of the staff at the Dickey Center for organizing this anniversary celebration and for organizing so many things that add so much to this community. We are engaged by the dynamic array of speakers and programs that celebrate the legacy of President Dickey, and we applaud in gratitude the wonderful contributions of the center that's named in his honor. As the 12th president of Dartmouth College, John Sloan Dickey changed this institution in some extraordinary ways. Under his leadership, the college grew physically, adding, among many facilities, the Hopkins Center for the Performing Arts. But his presidency was marked by his consistent affirmation of Dartmouth's purpose and our hopes for our graduates, our hope for what it is that they would do. For most of the 25 years that he served as president, he welcomed new and returning students with the same charge every year. First, you are citizens of a community, and you are expected to act as such. Secondly, you are the stuff of an institution, and what you are, it will be. And thirdly, your business here is learning, and that is up to you. Some students in the Dickey years wondered if they were up to the task that he set for them. And I think his confidence in their abilities never wavered. During a debate over a particularly divisive and contentious issue, he told students, if you do not learn to challenge injustice here, in the confines of this campus, how can you expect to exercise leadership in a more complex external environment? But his impact on the young men of Dartmouth went far beyond inspiration. With the development of the Great Issues course, he, along with the faculty, invited all students to engage in a broader conversation about the world's troubles. In and out of the classroom, our students began to see how economics, politics, education, and culture impacted our decisions as a nation and as an international community. He hoped, as surely I do, that as students unravel the underlying motivations and the root causes of poverty and war and hatred, they would also begin to consider ways in which they might make a difference in addressing these matters. His call to action lives on in this community. He would be very proud of our students today and what it is that they do. More than 60% of our students participate in voluntary service here in the Upper Valley and around the world. And Dean Stewart Lord is here today, the Dean of the Tucker Foundation, which is such an important device and means for them to engage in addressing the world's problems. They do work locally, but also in hurricane-affected areas in Belarus and Tanzania and Nicaragua. Dartmouth is also first in graduating Peace Corps volunteers among small schools, and we have held that honor for a number of years. For the last 2 years, some of you may not know that over 10% of our graduates signed up for Teach for America. Over 1 in 10 of students who are in a position where they could take on really any of a number of opportunities, where they could make a lot more money than they can as teaching in some of our poorest school districts, but they have signed up for this. As one recent Teach for America participant wrote, and it says so much about the culture and the attitude of these students, "I would never in a million years have foreseen myself doing this 4 years ago. I am profoundly grateful for the tremendous luck I've had to attend Dartmouth. Now, with the benefit of 4 years on the Hanover Plain, I feel better prepared than ever to actually do something about the often grave and daunting problems which haunt our world today." What a tribute this is to our students and to the culture that they bring and that they increment on this campus. This is a place, this campus, this faculty, marked by remarkable scholarship that shapes and enriches our world. Goodness, if you look at what our faculty contribute to helping to solve the world's problems, it is so significant and so inspiring. But quite frankly, I cannot think of a better contribution that Dartmouth can make to the world than to educate the most talented students of this generation to be the leaders of the next generation. As leaders in the next generation, it is even more critical that our students will have the skills and the knowledge necessary to navigate successfully in a global community. We already do much in this area. Nearly 60% of our students participate in off-campus programs around the world. We are among the leaders in American colleges and universities in this regard. Moreover, these programs are staffed by Dartmouth faculty and are an integral part of the Dartmouth curriculum. And for more than 2 decades now, for a quarter of a century, the Dickey Center has ensured that students and faculty have the opportunity here to learn from the most innovative and experienced global leaders of our time. This remarkable resource provides a much-needed forum for dialogue, debate, and action on the most important global issues. I often like to repeat a line of President Dickey's. I believe it was the time of convocation in the fall of 1963 that he used this line. He told students that they needed to develop a capacity for being undismayed when, as happens to all of us, we come face to face with change that we never made nor foresaw, and in fact, damn well don't like. We have to be prepared for this change, because he assured them this is the only thing he could promise would mark their lives. This is a sentiment that I very much agree with. When we talk about the world that our students of the 21st century will face, none of us can predict what it will be. All we can predict is there will be a time of tremendous tension, tremendous change, and a time that will call for leadership. Time for leadership that's grounded in values and a sense of purpose. And the best that we can do here is to prepare them for that task and for that assignment. Those who adapt, those who can imagine, Those who can stay anchored in value and fixed in purpose, these are the ones who can endure change, and indeed, these are the ones who can lead in a world of change. Our students, our alumni, all of us need to fight for our vision of the world in which we wish to live. We are not simply passive riders on this earth. We are not simply passive participants in history. We need to think of how we wish to help shape the world in which we will live. We have a tremendous ability to make a difference, but more importantly, we have a responsibility to try to make a difference. Now, this afternoon, it's a delight for me. I came here in President Dickey's last year as president, so I can honestly say that I served under John Dickey. As a first-year assistant professor, I surely did not come to know him, but I did come to know him a decade or so later and talked to him fairly often and came to admire immensely. And I continue to read his writings and to learn and be inspired from what he said and what he represented. So it's a treat for me to be able to be here and to recognize the 25th anniversary of the Dickey Center. But it's also a delight for me to honor somebody who met President Dickey's charge to make the world's troubles his troubles, and who has strengthened Dartmouth's commitment to internationalism immeasurably. It has been my pleasure to know Sandy McCullough for many years, I guess nearly as many years as I've been at Dartmouth. We're not as many years as he's been here, but quite a few. A member of the great class of 1950, since graduation, he's offered Dartmouth his leadership as a class volunteer, as a trustee, including service as chair of the board, and as a mentor and as a guide to countless students, to administrators, to trustees, to all of us, as a mentor and a guide. I had the privilege, I think, Sandy, it was in the spring of 1981, of spending an evening with you and Dottie and spending the night there, and it was shortly after you'd had a meeting with John Dickey. You had him down to talk about what it is that you might do. And you're very excited in sharing with me the vision of what this center might be. You alone of any of us in this room can assess whether or not we have begun to meet that vision, because you had high aspirations, as did he. But on this occasion, marking the 25th anniversary, I wonder if you'd come up here. I'd like to read a letter from the president, the current president of Dartmouth College, to somebody whom he admires very much.
Yes. You're too kind.
Dear Sandy, on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Dickey Center for International Understanding, it is Dartmouth's privilege and pleasure to recognize the critical role you have played in the center's founding and its development. As a student, you were profoundly influenced by your contact with President Dickey and your studies at the college he so wisely led. You embraced his vision, and as a graduate and a trustee, you helped Dartmouth to build upon his legacy. For 25 years, the Dickey Center has enriched the learning of Dartmouth's faculty and students. It has helped to ensure our ongoing awareness of our ultimate context, which stretches far beyond the Upper Valley to all reaches of the globe. Through internships, seminars, the War and Peace Studies minor, the Initiative on Global Health, and a range of interdisciplinary initiatives and programs for faculty and students, the center has encouraged and supported our efforts to embrace the world's problems as our own. Dartmouth owes you our deep gratitude for your generosity and leadership. In your work for the center and the college, as a graduate and as a public citizen, you have consistently advocated for better, wider, deeper understanding. Thank you for all that you do. As we celebrate the Dickey Center's first quarter century, we salute you, good friend. Thank you for all that you've done. I have the formal letter here for you.
Just one word.
Okay.
I would only say that if you see a turtle up on a fence post sunning himself, you know he didn't get up there by himself. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you very much, Jim and Sandy. Now I would like to introduce Professor Edward Luck of Columbia University, who will in turn introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Brundtland. Professor Luck is a member of the class of 1970, and also, I'm very pleased to say, a member of the Dickey Center Board of Visitors. And he is also one of the leading American experts on the United Nations. He is currently Professor of Practice in International and Public Affairs and Director of the Center on International Organization of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Boy, that would be nice on a card, wow. Woo. From 1997 to 2001, he was founder and executive director of the Center for the Study of International Organization, a research center jointly established by the School of Law of New York University and the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs of Princeton University. From 1994 to 1998, he was President Emeritus of the United Nations Association of the United States, which is America's principal center for public education on the United Nations. A frequent media commentator, Ed Luck has published extensively and testified before Congress on arms control, defense, and foreign policy, Russian and East Asian affairs, as well as on United Nations reform and peacekeeping. Please welcome Professor Ed Luck.
Thank you, Ken. That was a very generous introduction, given that this is only an introduction. I must say, this is a singular pleasure and honor to be able to introduce Gro Harlem Brundtland. Actually, I did this once 2 years ago, and I wasn't quite up to par, so they're giving me a second chance to try to do it again. The only thing I remember in common was that it was a huge overflowing audience at that time. That was for the release of the high-level panel that the Secretary General had put together on threats, challenges, and change. And she was a leading member of that panel. I had hoped at that point that the overflow audience was because of the introduction. I'm hoping this is true again. But on the off chance that that is not true, I will try to be fairly quick about this, which is not so easy because Gro Harlem Brundtland has done a great deal. Many people say there's sort of a leadership vacuum in the world, but it seems to me Dr. Brundtland on her own pretty much fills up that vacuum and gives us hope for the future and hope for future generations. One of the things I think that is really striking about her is that you always know where she stands. She's very passionate about her issues, she cares deeply, and she stays with them. She's not someone who follows the barometer of public opinion polls or what happens to be popular. She's someone who cares very, very deeply. There's several areas where she's really made a big difference, and they come up again and again and again in her career. One, obviously, is health. Another is the environment. Another is development. Another, women. And finally, international organization and trying to make the UN a better and stronger place. She has been devoted to public service of a kind and of a dimension that knows no boundaries, be they intellectual, political, or national. She started her career, which has been a very extraordinary one, in a fairly simple, straightforward way, which I think is encouraging for all of you who may indeed want to follow in her footsteps. She followed her father to medical school. She got her medical degree at the University of Oslo. She then took a very odd detour, and it's actually the only blemish on her career. She went to Harvard to get her Master's of Public Health, and unfortunately she's kept a tie there now and then as being a health policy fellow of that institution. And a distinguished fellow at the undistinguished Kennedy School. But other than that, the rest of it is really quite glowing, and so we all can learn to overcome our mistakes, and that's certainly reassuring. She started off in public health, but very quickly was drawn into other occupations. When she was only 35, she was tapped to be Minister of the Environment. When she was only 41, she became the youngest Prime Minister of Norway. not to mention the first woman. That was not the last time that she was to be Prime Minister of Norway. She came back again and again. On 3 occasions, she was Prime Minister. If you add it all up, it's more than a decade of service. And she has remained devoted to her Labour Party to this day. Above and beyond her service to her nation, she has given great service to the world. In 1983, she was tapped to become the chairwoman of the World Commission on Environment and Development. No one remembers that title, but everyone remembers the Brundtland Commission. Among other things, it was the one that gave us the whole concept of sustainable development. Not only was that a good concept for development, it was one intellectually and in terms of policy is still with us. It was actually a sustainable policy idea, and that, of course, is highly unusual. In addition to that, she served at the World Health Organization as the Director General for 5 years from 1998 to 2003. There she did many things, among them to recognize that health indeed is a very broad concept. It relates to things like microeconomics, it relates to violence, it relates to the nature of societies. And as always, she saw things in a bigger context and a broader way than many of us in academia do. In 2003, the Scientific American named her Policy Leader of the Year for her leadership in preventing a global SARS pandemic. She, in addition to her service there, has been someone who has been really essential to the whole thinking and the conception of what the UN and international institutions are all about. I mentioned the high-level panel, which was a seminal work, which I think also will have a long shelf life. She was absolutely a critical force in that whole effort. In a somewhat similar vein, a few years earlier, I had the privilege of working with her on an international panel headed by Lord Carrington on international enforcement and how to make the UN Security Council work better. And I think what has impressed all of us is that she's able to pull all of these different issues together into a single thread. She sees the connections. As she said at one point, it is simple, really. Human health and the health of the ecosystem are inseparable. The individual, the national, the global are all of one piece. Now, in addition to all these issues that she's been dedicated to, it's worth mentioning that she also has a long-standing marriage. We're very lucky to have Dr. Arne Olaf Brundtland with us. He is a political scientist. He has written a number of books, including about relationships among the Nordic countries. He's obviously more successful than our political scientists. There have been no wars among the Nordic countries since he's been writing. So this, I think, is a singular tribute. But he's also written 2 other books. One was called Married to Grow. That apparently did so well that he did a second book called Still Married to Grow. So I assume he's working on a 3rd book, but probably the hardest thing is finding a title after those 2. But before postponing this anymore, let me just say that you're in for a real treat. She's an extraordinary speaker as well as an extraordinary leader. It seems to me that her message about human welfare is one that is both timeless on the one hand and has great urgency on the other. And I think she will focus, and I think as she always does, on what future generations can do, and obviously those from this college hopefully will be in the vanguard of that effort. So, Dr. Brundtland.
Well, good evening, everyone. You know, sometimes those introductions really scare you, don't they? So you better forget the whole thing and start on, because you know, you're a normal person, and now I'm even retired several years. I come here and have to sit on a chair because my hips need an operation. I'm getting on, you know, with my years even. But I enjoy being here with you, and it's nice to have so many students tonight. And my husband, always now, since I retired, he's always with me. Because why should we spend our time, separate now that after all those working years, in all the different capacities and hard work, we usually didn't have time. So now he's with me to Dartmouth. We enjoy it, and we were even back at Harvard together about 3 years ago after I had stepped down from the World Health Organization and saw the old buildings and the old atmosphere of studying together or being together at Harvard more than 40 years ago. Well, coming from Norway, the country that has been chosen by Alfred Nobel to be the venue of the Nobel Peace Prize, I thought I would start by reflecting upon the implications of the last 3 peace prizes and their important contributions, those awardees, to world peace. First, Wangari Maathai, a Kenyan woman who was chosen to inspire change by mobilizing women and entire communities to plant trees and pursuing sustainable development. Second, Shirin Ebadi, a woman and lawyer activist in her country, Iran, promoting human rights in such a male-dominated and suppressive society. Thirdly, this year, Mohammed Yunus, an economist who has worked tirelessly over the last 30 years to create economic opportunities for poor people of Bangladesh and beyond gradually. His simple conviction was that by trusting people, you could give them a real chance in life. Small sums of money make a decisive difference for people who own nothing and have nothing to put up as security for a loan. So the Grameen Bank that he created has had more than 98% returns on their loans with interest. And this is more than what is generally expected in the traditional banking sector. Millions of poor families have been able to create small enterprises, earn a living, and give their children health, education, and real opportunities in life. Now, why are these 3 prize winners linked to the pursuit of peace? Why did, in fact, the Nobel Committee risk criticism for these not-so-traditional choices? On environment and sustainable development in Africa, on human rights in Iran, or on new ideas for the overcoming of poverty? And why were all 3 directly linked to the role of women in societies? Well, I say that since even in the case of the Grameen Bank, the choice that bank made was to focus on women. They are the ones that are entitled to loans, who decide how best to spend it to the benefit of the children and the family. Now, the answer is there will be no global solutions, no global peace, without human rights, without sustainable development, without a narrowing of the gaps between rich and poor. Our common future depends upon a growing understanding and sense of responsibility for the rights and the opportunities of all. Now, as I go back to my childhood years, I am aware that my international commitment stemmed from the early exposure to strong values and beliefs about social justice, about the inherent right of every individual, and about the responsibility we all have to try to make a difference. These values about human dignity, about equality between men and women, about a fair and just society, have always, in my own mind, had an international perspective. How could they not? They could not only apply to your own neighborhood, or your own country, or even your own region of the world. My year at Harvard School of Public Health reconfirmed and deepened my international commitment. I was exposed to different cultures and religions. 25 years old and the youngest in my class. And that gave me wonderful opportunities. Learning from others, people with more experience who had chosen to focus on public health. And I had fellow students from all around the world. Now, in the last 40 years, I have increasingly focused on global issues and perspectives. First, as a young environment minister, then prime minister, and as director general of the World Health Organization. Now, as I look at those years, I believe that 2003, the year I left WHO, it will be an historic year for global public health. Not only did we succeed to agree globally on the first ever treaty, health treaty, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, a true gift to the world, a true gift to future generations. Also, we faced up to a global infectious disease threat, SARS. It was an outbreak that underlined the crucial role of the World Health Organization and of international health collaboration. It captured imaginations, often more column inches than the war in Iraq, going on at the same time, and always more headlines than AIDS, TB, or malaria. One person infected staying at an international hotel put the world at risk. And unlike other diseases which we can prevent or treat, SARS was undiagnosable, untreatable, and for 1 of every 6 to 10 people, fatal. The way the world responded to SARS was global public health at its best. Scientists put aside their differences and the drive to be the first. They shared sequencing and studied results. Public health authorities from opposite sides of the globe flew and came together in Geneva to share their experiences with SARS, their successes and their failures with 192 member states. And as a result, in just 4 short months, we had identified a new disease, unknown, and contained a global outbreak which could have become a global catastrophe. Now, the short, sharp shock made us all stand up and pay attention. Due to the speed of science and using the best evidence, we quickly knew that SARS could infect anyone, anywhere. Governments were committed, resources made available, and people made aware, health workers given tools for action, information shared across borders. In short, there was global mobilization to fight a global threat. And the result? We probably won't find ourselves 10 years down the road with SARS also endemic in the countries which can least afford it, devastating lives and economies because we acted and acted together. Not long after, the threat, which is still there, of avian flu, mirroring the tragedy of early last century, became an increasing concern. But WHO could now more easily than before rally countries to mobilize, securing the infrastructures and preventive measures necessary to face up to a potentially global challenge. Now, moving from that, in the fall of 2003, the Secretary General Kofi Annan made an urgent call to the nations of the world in an address to the General Assembly. He mentioned how he had seen the shared vision at the Millennium Summit a few years back, a vision of global solidarity and collective action and security, he reminded delegates that recent events, and that was all the split which happened in the international community in the aftermath of the Iraq War, and the differences of opinion around it. That consensus, which was created and confirmed in 2000, was called into question. And he announced, therefore, that he would establish a high-level panel to analyze the present and future challenges to peace and security, and to consider the contribution which collective action could make in addressing those, to recommend ways of strengthening international collaboration and the United Nations. I'm honored to have been part of that process, and I focus much of my attention to the challenges of social injustice, disease, lack of development, and poverty. But a key message from that panel was the following, and I think this will stand the test of history. Depending on wealth, geography, and power, we perceive different threats as the most pressing ones. But the truth is, we cannot afford to choose. Collective security depends on accepting that the threats which each region of the world perceives as most urgent are in fact equally so for all. In our globalized world, the threats we face are interconnected. The rich are vulnerable to the threats that attack the poor, and the strong are vulnerable to the threats against the weak. A nuclear terrorist attack on the United States or Europe would have devastating effects on the whole world, but so would the appearance of a virulent pandemic in a poor country with no effective healthcare system. On this interconnectedness of threats, we must found a new security consensus, which has to mean that we all are entitled to freedom from fear, and that whatever threatens one threatens all. Once we understand this, we have no choice but to tackle the whole range of threats. We must respond to HIV/AIDS as robustly as we do to terrorism, to poverty, and to environmental threats as we do to nuclear proliferation. Now, my own experience in life has all the time led me to concentrate on the links between people and the environment, between health and development, and the crucial observation that there is no common future unless we invest in people, in all people, in their future health and well-being. Without it, there will be no hope for sustainable development, prosperity, or peace. Remember, when we think back, when Indira Gandhi came to Stockholm in 1972 for the first UN conference on the environment, she declared, "Poverty is the greatest polluter." She was right. While in the North, we had become increasingly worried about the dramatic changes to the environment due to human activities, industry, agriculture, and transport, this was seen by the developing world as a luxury concern for the rich. The big problem was the trends were serious. They were global, and they could not just be pushed aside. Our common future is dependent on real change in our patterns of production and consumption. The only way forward is through a much expanded model of collaboration between North and South. The right to development is as crucial as the right to a clean environment, which was a main conclusion in our common future, the report we presented to the world back in 1987. There is no other way to secure both these rights than through a pattern of sustainable development, one that ensures that it meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Now, processes of change are happening, although it's far from enough, as we all know. And climate and energy policies, and I saw yesterday on the television screen here, as I was switching from one channel to the other, that climate change was on at least 3 or 4 different channels last night. And that's new, because I have switched a lot on American channels over the years. Now, so there is climate and energy policies much too slowly pursued, at great cost, we have seen, as the Stern report that was issued a few months ago once more has reminded us all. And it has been one factor in increasing the understanding and the awareness around climate change. Last week, as powerful actors on the global scene met in Davos at the World Economic Forum, climate change finally was high on the agenda. People now fear climate disruptions, and they call for leadership. I guess this is one thing that is new. Al Gore's film, is one of several aspects that has risen on the minds of people and made people more aware. Political leaders, even in the US, are taking serious initiatives, such as in California. Even the president chose to focus on energy and the need for change in his State of the Union address. There is a big discussion whether this is really a serious new thing or not. But in any case, there's a difference in the climate, the political climate, when this issue is taken up in that context. And I think there is new hope now that the world will be taking more serious steps together to face a challenge that is common to us all. I mentioned how the world's leaders agreed around the Millennium Summit, and they agreed on Millennium Development Goals, as you know. And one of the important ones was that to alleviate poverty, to move towards a healthier population, education, human rights, and to safeguard the environment. I believe that we must be uncompromising in our determination to eradicate poverty. Poverty is a major cause of environmental degradation in the third world. Poor people will concentrate on their daily survival. They will be forced to cut down trees, overgraze pastures, and overuse farmland in order to stay alive. And poor countries will be forced to overexploit their natural resources, to produce the export goods needed to pay for necessary import. And in generally, this picture illustrates the great importance of improved rules for global trade. Another big stumbling block as we see the world struggling and not getting onto a real agreement in the important area of trade. Now, if we look at the health scenario, as we look at the great achievements of the last century in that area, successes in health have been very unevenly distributed. 1.3 billion people have entered this century without having benefited from the health revolution. Those are the people who are still living in absolute poverty. The health impact of that inequality gap is staggering. Despite the rising average global life expectancy, in the least developed countries, 3 out of 4 people die before the age of 50. Infant mortality is almost 7 times higher in a developing country than in industrialized ones. And a child born today in a developing country runs a 1,000-fold risk of dying from measles than a child in an industrialized country, which is why the measles campaign that is going on is so essential. Children living in absolute poverty have a 5-fold greater risk of dying before their 5th birthday than their wealthier counterparts. But the worst statistics of all are illustrated by the fact that in Africa, in the places where women face the greatest challenges, they face the risk of death 1 to 16 as they are in childbearing age and have the risk of dying through becoming mothers. And here is the biggest difference in indicators, and because it hits only 1 woman in 4,000 in our world. 1 in 16 in the worst places in Africa, and 1 in 4,000 in the Western Europe or the United States. And of course, 70% of the world's poor are women, which is why the focus on women, as I mentioned, with regard to the Grameen Bank, with regard to the planting of trees, and the activist Kenyan Nobel Prize winner, the role of women and therefore the role of children and the next generation is so essential. In the North, we must recognize that nobody, not even the richest, can hide from the global trends. There is no way to get away from the consequences of environmental degradation. There will be no sanctuaries where some people can escape the harsh realities. We would all suffer from the radiation if the ozone layer would be further damaged, and climate change, as we know, can cause drought, floods, and disruption of agricultural patterns, both in the north and in the south. And hundreds of millions of people are living in areas which would be affected by a rise in the sea level. And as we know now, the scientific consensus on these issues is very strong. So the question marks that for political reasons or other reasons are being placed behind the knowledge of science in the area of climate change are really no longer relevant at all and can be dismissed. Our security also depends as much on economic well-being, on social justice and ecological stability as it does on military threats. Throughout human history, struggles over land and access to natural resources have been one of the root causes of tension and conflict. And we risk a proliferation of such disputes if the rapid deterioration of environmental quality is allowed to continue. And as globalization has continued so rapidly, and as governance issues in a wide sense have become more and more cross-sectoral, cross-boundary, and plainly global, the need to create partnerships and collaboration at all levels have become more and more obvious. The roles of business and the private sector, as compared to the role of state, has been a recurrent theme over the 30, 40 years that I have been working in this area. 15 years ago, the typical opinion was one of asking for a clear separation and preferably a state as small as possible. Let the state and the politicians deal with their job and let us get on with ours, was the typical business private sector perspective. I happen to believe that this kind of analysis has never been particularly wise. We do better in all of our societies if we are willing to listen and learn from each other. In fact, since public policies decide on the framework within which business can work and must operate, who can hope for a good and consistent solution for business unless they are part of analyzing the issues and willing to realize the role of democracy and the role of politicians, their responsibility for the whole of society. The private sector needs clear rules to follow in a globalized world. Nations need to work internationally to face a range of complex and interlinked issues that have become more and more transnational. And looking at it from a national or a global perspective, we are dependent upon one another, the public and the private sector, to create a more level playing field, which is what much of the debate really is about. Not only rules of trade, but issues of environment, human rights, social security, health, and education are of great importance to all of society, including of importance to the business sector itself. Now, the belief that we can do better through separation of powers and by staying on our own turf is no longer viable, confronted as we are today with complex and interconnected issues that make us so interdependent and potentially ever more vulnerable. By working together and taking seriously the concerns of everyone involved, respecting the mandates of different partners, we can inspire the best solutions, combining the creativity and the insights of both the private and public sectors. Now, this is what has evolved, this thinking, by in our international institutions, symbolized by Kofi Annan, UN Secretary General, as he visited Davos as a key speaker in 1999. He then invited the business community to join in a partnership effort on global challenges, while underlining the key issues of human rights, labor rights, and the environment. And as we presented our report, Our Common Future, back in 1987, nearly 20 years ago, one of our key observations were that we can only have a common future through a much more collaborative approach. So back then, we involved in our analysis the scientific community, the private sector, the business community, and of course governments and NGOs in a collaborative effort to analyze the issues and to debate the solutions. And I believe as strongly as 20 years ago, this is still the only way forward. There is no other alternative than this kind of thinking. It is crucial to all follow up. It is still the challenge to us all in a globalized and increasingly globalized world. Now, I'm going to share with you some of my positive experiences from WHO. Why? Because I sense that there is such a lot of pessimism, such a lot of sentiment saying, what does it matter? Can it really make a difference? Is it possible to have change? You know, nothing can be done. The world cannot be changed, so why bother? You know, this kind of pessimistic atmosphere is a very dangerous threat, I think, to all of us. So that's why I will say this, that first of all, health is precious for all of us, for every child, for every woman, for every society. So how can we hope to live productive lives if the right to health is beyond reach? We cannot hope to reduce poverty, to create economic growth, and integrate the poorest parts of our world in a global economy unless we drastically beat back the epidemics that are killing millions and draining the energy from hundreds of millions more. And I say, you know, we can do it. We can change the world in these areas. When I took the helm at the World Health Organization back in 1998, it's 8 years ago, AIDS, TB, and malaria were expanding mostly unchecked through large parts of the world. And there was little hope that we could treat the tens of millions already infected with HIV. Nobody even thought it was possible. Or turn around the malaria epidemic. Rates of routine immunization of children were going down, stagnated, or declining. Treatment for AIDS was out of the question. It was not on the table at all back in '98. I'm talking now about developing countries, not about Norway or the United States. Now the prices for drugs for AIDS are no longer prohibitive, and we are rolling gradually out treatment for millions. New drugs, long-lasting bed nets, have given us hope that we can drastically reduce the deaths from malaria. There is progress in the fight against the age-old threat of tuberculosis, which had seen a deadly revival, preying on those already weakened by HIV/AIDS. Today, immunization levels have begun to climb, and new vaccines are protecting many more children. Now, so that you don't misunderstand me, this is not telling that because I came to WHO in '98, all of these things have changed. But the fact of the matter is that what was impossible to imagine in '98 is now happening. And there are many reasons for it. But it gives great hope that change can happen and that people can rise to the occasion. New private and public initiatives have made a big difference. The Gates Foundation, Gavi, the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, the Global TB Drug Facility, and numerous others are already securing results unthinkable even 5 years ago. So today we can say with certainty to everyone who says, why should I bother? Why should I give my money? Why should I ask my government to pay more in development aid? Well, you can say with certainty, we can do it. We know what works. We can actually reach the targets which are set by the world's leaders in 2000. The number of deaths, halving the number of deaths from malaria and TB. We can reduce new HIV infections. And we can do this with the necessary political and economic support from rich countries and with a clear commitment from developing countries themselves, which is gradually also coming on. There are, of course, in Africa, many places you have a downward spiral. You have other areas, China, India, Central Asian republics, where AIDS is creeping in. And knowing the impact in so many other areas, we can certainly not stand back and see this AIDS pandemic just continuing, moving ahead. But a critical test of the matter now, as years pass, and we know what works and can be done, is the funding and is the willingness to put the political determination behind an effective action that does not cost that much. It's not true that it cannot be done within reasonable limits. And I have to say, because I have been reminded by African leaders, among others, because I always was a little shy to tell in my speeches, back 10, 15 years ago and so on, about the Nordic countries and the level of commitment in development aid that we were giving over the years and every year. You know, we didn't say it because people in the bigger rich countries didn't like to hear it. So, but I have decided I'm going to say it. And I'm going to say, if we can do it in the north of Europe, surely other rich countries can. Remember, all industrialized countries have promised to contribute at least 0.7% of GDP for development assistance. And so in my mind, there is absolutely no excuse. It is not a big sum of money for rich countries like ours. And with a small fraction of that 1%, you can move and do all these things that I have mentioned and see to it that new generations of children have a completely different life where our preventive action, the things that we take for granted, can happen and can prevent so much human suffering and so much loss of economic potential. It's not only a question of human rights. It's not only a question of saving children and families. It's a question of improving the basis for societies and for our global economy. Now, I just want to share with you a few observations, finally, about moving health into the center of the development debate and getting universal recognition that health is a crucial element in development was one of the driving forces behind my work in the World Health Organization. I concluded that the same principles which guided me as a politician should dominate the direction we took for WHO. We would rely on the best possible scientific evidence and let this knowledge set the course. But we should also weigh all our actions to ensure that WHO's work always benefited the poor. Although 84% of the world's population live in low and middle income countries, they account for only 18% of world income, and even worse, for only 11% of global health spending. And yet these countries bear 93% of the disease burden globally. And I have often had to explain to people when I speak about collaborating private and public sector. I always had ideologues in NGOs or in WHO or other places saying, shouldn't we focus on having a health service that is publicly based, like in the Nordic countries or in the Great Britain? We shouldn't have a private health system. And I said, look, have you forgotten that in the poor countries, there is no public sector in the health field? Frankly speaking, it's all privatized because there is nothing for the poor people. So this is the consequence of a private system. So what we need to do is that if you start looking at the world, the rich countries, they have health insurance. They have a public system. They normally, middle income and rich countries, they have health and education as something that is part of the society's basis, and where in some way or some form, most people have access to health and education. So the public sector has at least 50%, up to 80% of the economic spending in the health and education sector in rich countries. And the thing is that there is both out from equity and efficiency, rich countries have come to the conclusion this is necessary in order to have a productive economy and to have a population that is educated and that can grow up to be healthy individuals. In recent years, it has become abundantly clear in reports from the OECD that nations that invest considerable resources on social security, health and education for all also are generally more productive societies, such as in the case of the Nordic countries. We do better because we invest in all our people. The liberalistic idea that the state should retreat or remain slim and leave most issues to the market had its high days in the 1980s, during the time when President Reagan dominated the debate in the United States and Prime Minister Thatcher in the United Kingdom. The problem is that unless we invest in people, in all people, societies, not just individuals, lose out. And this is a realization that many people up until now are not completely aware of. So as Indira Gandhi said when she came to Stockholm, also, she said, no market is going to take care of the delivery of health services to my people, she said, because she was explained how important it is with market forces. And she said, well, I don't see those forces taking care of my people. No. Right. A market, however, can be created. You can create a market that takes care of your people. And that has to be done through democratic means while securing the basic human rights of every citizen. It can be done in different ways. You can do in different ways, make a society function with regard to delivering health and education to the people. But you cannot avoid taking it seriously and finding a way where shared responsibility is part of the solution. You can make different kinds of health insurance systems, but if you don't make them, and if you don't see to it that you have a system that also serves the poor, then you are really losing out with regard to the future of your society. Now, I'll give you one example before I end. Because we saw in Eastern Europe, Russia and China, as the old Marxist Soviet systems were falling apart, that it in some areas had dire consequences negatively. It happened in China also, because when people had been covered by health and education systems, and they privatized the systems, abolished them, there was nothing instead. And what happened? Increasing, of course, poverty and many negative, but also badly deteriorating health indicators in those countries. Really dramatic in many cases. In Bolivia, Brazil, or Peru, the risk of dying before the age of 40 is more than double that in Sri Lanka. Well, one important reason is that although in a country like Sri Lanka is poorer than Peru, a lot poorer than Brazil, and the investment in health per person is half that of Peru's, you still have people living longer and healthier lives in Sri Lanka. Why? Because the effort in health and education is more evenly distributed. It reaches all, and that makes a big difference. So one could argue today that can poor countries afford not to have a basic health system in place that can help bring groups of their population out of poverty and to help secure greater productivity? No, they can't afford it. But at the moment, in many of these situations, they need our help to overcome the barriers and to have a chance of investing sufficiently to bring their people out of a hopeless poverty situation, which is why we must have common responsibility to make those efforts, and it doesn't take more than what is reasonable for us to be able to participate in making happen. So whether we think of lasting and sustainable development solutions to environmental concerns, whether we think of security challenges or the scourge of poverty, there is no alternative to building the moral and scientific basis for taking more shared responsibility across nations and continents. This is a key lesson based on all our experience, I believe, over the last 100 years. It is up to each and every one of us to do our part in making that happen in our own society and across all borders. And this is where each one of us, when we vote, when we choose how to work, when we choose what to study, and when we choose, for instance, to go to Dartmouth, and take the consequences of the learning here, it's all up to us, because democracy is gaining ground in the world, and democracy is all about every one of us and what we are able to contribute. Thank you very much.
Good. We have time for a few questions, and as our tradition, we'll recognize students first. So please raise your hands. Is there a student in the back? Good, please.
Can you discuss the effect of corruption both at the national level and then at the international level, and how that compounds some of the things you're talking about?
Yeah.
In your experience?
You know, last night we had a small dinner, and I was told about the work that Dartmouth and the Dickey Center and part of the Dartmouth College system is having with countries in Africa, for instance, Tanzania. And before the name Tanzania was mentioned, while we were more generally talking about African country in Africa, my first question was the question you raised now. You know, how are you experiencing the problems around corruption? And I asked because I know that whether it's from a European or American perspective, and you work with people in faraway countries, as long as you work directly with the poor people, delivering them vaccines, medications, and bed nets for $3 a piece, you know, you have no problem in saying this is worth it. But the moment you must work also with governments and with institutions in countries, and then you can more quickly enter into those kinds of problems. And whatever we do, we just have to try to minimize the consequences and to look for those institutions, those people, those persons where we are working who are least at risk or least of the type that would benefit from that kind of line. Because the alternative to not move and try improve the conditions, whether in Kenya, Nigeria, or Tanzania, or any African country, is not an alternative to us. I remember when I was quite a young woman before I became environment minister, so I was somewhere early 30s. There was an election campaign, and I was there with my party, and a person came up to me and angry, like this, and saying, why do we spend all this money on development aid? Because he had read in the paper that a Norwegian ship with which was carrying food of some kind and materials, which was part of development cooperation, had been entered and people had stolen the goods, and it was lost. And I remember how I decided that I'm going to defend the duty that Norway still has to try to help the poor states and the country and the people of India because of our much better situation and the fact that we could try to make a difference, even in the face of problems. So I think we just have to realize that these countries are historically at another stage than our own. They need to get sufficient inspiration and collaboration to learn the positive sides and experiences that helps change the atmosphere. You can't say, look, we're moving out here. You can do it with a government. Norway did it once with Kenya. We moved out after many years of development cooperation with Kenya because we were so fed up with the government corruption in Kenya. And the fact that although we had a continuous dialogue, they were not improvable. I mean, they were hopeless. But when I visited Kenya during my time of environment with the work on the commission, I mean, it was heartbreaking to see that Norwegian development projects that had been going well in Kenya had reached a lot of people. They had closed down because we were sanctioning the government of Kenya. So I think it just illustrates to us the dilemma that you cannot have a pure soul and say we don't like corruption, so we move out. Because we have to help the countries also overcome corruption on behalf of their people. Okay.
I guess my question to you, I feel that in my generation and in this field, being part of Dartmouth as an institution, we're provided with these experiences from people like you and in situations where we're provided with the research and the background knowledge of these problems. And we're kind of in a situation where we're faced with this challenge of whether we can, okay, take this and find more problems, and, you know, there are plenty out there to find,
Yeah.
or do we go and start searching for solutions? And is this the time when we have all the knowledge and all these studies to show us where we need to invest our time to find those solutions, you know, concentrate on how we do that? And I guess my question is to you, how do you envision the people and the students of my generation going forward with that challenge?
Yeah, well, what I think is that, I mean, we as individuals, we are different. Some of us, well, all of us need to have a knowledge and an understanding of our own society and of the world, and as much as possible. But we have different traits, personality traits, and preferences, and we may be in different capacities where we can make the most difference. Some people become social entrepreneurs. You know, they move into an area where they see that they can make a difference in developing a new product, going to another country or several countries and work with others to have that spread. Others are more NGO types and leaders of community where they want to focus on the politics of an issue or of increasing the awareness among decision makers. Others engage directly in the political arena. In my case, when I was young, wherever I was working, I was looking at, you know, what is unfair here? What needs to be changed? And then I started working on those issues and making a fuss and making trouble for my bosses and all this kind of, you know, this kind of person. And then one day I was very unusual. What happened was one day I was asked to enter the government. Very surprisingly, because I was working in science at that time on child growth and development. So in my case, I was asked to become a politician. But obviously, as I was there, it took me 3 months while I was kind of wondering, why do I always have to, I was always the one that had to lead the meeting. I always had to make the conclusions. You know, I had to learn becoming a leader and responsible for my ministry and the area of environment. Then after 3 months, the government nearly toppled because of a big issue in Parliament. And I realized that afternoon, when in 3 hours I thought we were going to fall, that everything in my mind that was being annoyed at never being able to relax a little, a moment in a meeting, but always being on top of everything, you know, which was kind of something you were not used to from my previous life. I realized, you know, what a much bigger difference you can make when you lead a system than when you are just part of it. So as those 3 hours were over, and I heard with a sigh of relief, you know, that I was not relieved from being a Minister of Environment because we were going to continue. From that day, I never made a complaint in my own mind or to my husband or anyone about how hard work it is to be a leader, because I realized how much more difference I could make. Now, this was in my case. But what I'm saying is we can all do different parts in this big puzzle. But we have to communicate so that everybody's experience can benefit the larger community, which is important, which is why also universities, NGOs, political parties, the media, everywhere where you can make a point and influence others and help promote change. So that's, I think, the bottom line is that wherever you do it, as long as the philosophy is you want to make your contribution to moving the world forward, it can be done in very many different ways. Yeah.
What a wonderful answer. Thank you. Another question? Take one more. Yep, Suhail.
Development is one of the critical issues that will sort of expand more into the development for people from third world. And something I'm curious about is that when people say that, how do they define development? In the sense that purely from a material perspective, people from the third world claim maybe 5 to 10% of the resources of people from the developed world, just in terms of material resources. And if development were defined as moving up on the material scale so that they could live a life closer to what we are privileged enough to live, would it be viable? Or is it possible for them to live a better life without us living a less materially demanding life?
Well, I mean, you know, you can answer the question from a kind of a moral perspective and say, no, it's not possible. But the fact of the matter is that's what the world is like today. And the distance between the material level of the poorest and the one that we have is just enormous and unbelievable. But as you look at the total impact on the environment of the way we are living, and especially, but it has to do both with climate change and with the use of energy, but also the way we eat and the way we overuse calories and all of it. And even the composition of our diet. I mean, all of it is a burden on the environment. So certainly change in the direction of sustainable development has to happen in all societies. And it's very important that the poor societies don't go through the same kinds of experiences and the same kind of polluting methodologies that we have been doing in the rich countries, which is why it's so important to be helping another energy mix, another way of producing and getting economic growth in countries that still have not started as much on the kind of energy based production that we have. But again, we have to help by using science and technology and move the cleaner technologies and help that happen in the poorer countries so that their pattern of development will give them economic assets, will give them social security and opportunities, because you cannot, development has to mean also higher material well-being in poor countries when you see the degree of poverty you have today. There is no way to avoid having considerable improvements also from a purely, classical economic growth point of view and in poor countries. But the mix and the way it's done is so important that we should all be getting up early in the morning to find out how to help. How to help. Yeah.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Okay.